My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and this is the virtual reading group. It's great to see you all. Here in New York, it's really the first week of spring, so here we are reading Hannah Arendt online. And yet I'm looking forward to it. This is the last session of this this effort to read a series of Arendt's texts on the topic of race. As you think about it, maybe send me an email or send Phil an email or Yana an email and let us know if you like this idea instead of reading just a book, which is the way we've typically done it over the last 8 to 9 years, picking a topic and reading some essays on that topic. I think there's a lot of advantages to it, and yet it's also, I know, hard for some people to find the texts and this and that, but I'd love to know what people think of this as a general idea. We have to think about what we're going to read next. I have a proposal. We don't have a whole lot of time before the summer, and then in the summer I get pretty busy at times. I'm traveling a lot this summer, but my proposal is that starting in 2 weeks on April 28th, we would start reading part 1 of Responsibility and Judgment. It's a book we've only read once in the reading group, and I don't think I've ever led that. I think it was Samantha Hill when she was here. And so I think it would be fun for us to read it together, and it's got some great essays in it. So we would meet the 28th to read Personal Responsibility and Dictatorship, May 5th, 12th, and 19th for some questions of moral philosophy, and June 2nd for Thinking and Moral Considerations, one of my favorite of all of her essays. And then we would take a break and then come back on July 21st and read a series of 4 to 5 or 6 weeks on Arendt and friendship. Some of you know that our next conference, October 12th and 13th, is on friendship. So my thought would be that we would then, like we're doing now, reading some essays topically related to the question of race, we would do it on the question of friendship. So anyway, that's my current idea. Feel free to email us and let us know what you think. You can also discuss it in the chat, and we'll try and take a look. But I just wanted to throw that out there as a possible next 2 ideas, which would take us probably into September. And then in September, we could decide what next bigger book we might want to read. We haven't read The Human Condition in a while. We haven't read On Revolution in a while. I haven't read Origins in a while. So those are certainly 3 possibilities, but there are others as well. So just let me know what you guys think. Okay.
What was the book again, Roger?
Which book?
The one that you're recommending?
Oh, the first part of Responsibility and Judgment. It's a collection of essays edited by Jerome Cohn.
I have no idea what that means, so it'd be good for me to read it.
Yeah, that would be. It's a great collection. There's 2 parts, and the first part, is most of the book, and then there's 4 shorter essays in part 2. We probably wouldn't, the way I'm currently proposing it, we wouldn't get to those, but we can always get to them at some point. So anyway, that's the proposal. So today is the last day in which we're going to be discussing Arendt on race. Certainly not the last time we'll talk about it. Some of you probably know that Yana and I are running a workshop this June up at Bard with 15 or 16 leading Arendt scholars coming to talk about Arendt and race. So it's something that we will continue to talk about, and we'll continue to inform our reading going forward. Today we assigned 3 letters. One the first one is written to Robert Hutchins. Some of you know he was a longtime president of the University of Chicago. At this point, he's the president of the Fund for the Republic in New York. And this is a letter Arendt writes to him in 1957, apparently shortly after they're at a luncheon together. I don't know what luncheon. And he's asking her advice on what this fund for the Republic should be funding and how they should be supporting research that would be meaningful for the future of the American Republic. The second is a letter that she writes to James Baldwin. This is in 1962, and it's a letter that is never answered, and is a response to Baldwin's essay "Letter from a Region of My Mind," which appeared in the New Yorker in November of 1962. November 17th. Arendt wrote it immediately after it appeared on November 21st, and we'll talk about that. And then the third is this, probably the most well-known of these three letters, the letter Arendt wrote to Ralph Ellison on July 29th, 1965. So I'll do them in chronological order, just so we have a sense of to the extent there is any development in her writing, although I'm not sure. Well, I think with the Ellison letter, we'll see that. And we'll have then a discussion. So this letter to Robert Hutchins from 1957, as remember, is the same year she wrote Reflections on Little Rock, although Reflections on Little Rock was not published until a few years later in 1959. She's commenting here on material that Hutchins sent to her, apparently about proposals for what this Fund for the Republic would be funding. And I think he asked her, what do you think of these proposals, and what kind of research should we be funding? And her answer is, it's a longer answer, but we're going to focus on some parts of it. But she starts and says, we have to begin with the basic issues. And she says empirical investigations, so social science, empirical investigations, she says, are of doubtful efficacy. They won't really help us with these fundamental underlying issues. But she says that doesn't mean we should pursue important questions about the Republic from the perspective of political philosophy. She says, no. Political philosophy, she says, remains lifeless and dry. There are many theories, she says, but they don't get tied back to experience and data. And this is an important methodological point, and I think it's absolutely central to understanding Arendt's basic approach. Sometimes people call her a philosopher. She denies that. She says her closest field is political theory, but she's not really even a political theorist. She's not someone who offers theories, castles in the air about politics. She's much more someone who, if you look at all of her writing, it starts with a question. It starts with a question about the real world, reality, and does what she here advises Hutchins to do and saying what kind of research they're going to fund. You approach basic issues not through political philosophy, but from an attempt to understand concrete issues, so that each factual issue, she says, of empirical importance is studied, so that in studying the factual issue, you disclose its foundations. You start from the surface, namely the factual issue, and then you dig deep and you seek to connect that surface phenomena with the basic questions and basic issues that are disclosed through experience. And then she offers a whole series of examples. And some of these examples are clearly examples that Hutchins had put in his proposal, and some I imagine are her own, although I don't know. The first, she says, is religious freedom, one that Hutchins had obviously articulated. And she questions whether this is one of the most important issues in the country. She thinks generally it's been decided that our country is a country of the United States is a country of religious tolerance and freedom. But she says there's one aspect of religious freedom that is, at least in a latent sense, in a hidden way, relevant today and important today. And that's the religious revival that's happening right now. This is, remember, 1957. So you're, time of McCarthyism, time of a renewed Christian right, which I think has been only growing for the last 70 years. And she says that there's this new sense that some people have that only Christian and God-fearing people can constitute a democracy. And she says this does raise what she calls one of these basic underlying deep issues about the relation between religion and politics. And this is the question of secularization. Secularization meant the emancipation of politics from religion. And she says the dangers of secularization are that with the loss of hell and heaven, you lose a kind of way to motivate people to be law-abiding. You don't have the punishments of hell or the rewards of heaven. And so there's the danger that religion in a secular world, cut off from its sort of real foundations, becomes simply a means to an end, and it can be mobilized for particular political ends. And I think clearly around issues like abortion and gay marriage and others in this country, you've seen that happen over the last 60 to 70 years. And so this would be an issue that Arendt says is was this time at least a latent issue, and I think has become more acute in her language over the last half a century. But then she says there are also acute issues, and she gives a number of examples. And the first example, and the one that's most relevant for us, is the example of what she calls the race issue in the South. Now, I should point out that there are some places where Arendt writes and says it may turn out that the race issue in the North is as problematic and maybe more problematic than it is in the South. But here she frames it as the race issue. And she says the reason that this is an acute issue, but the underlying basic problems, right? Again, you start on the surface and you go down, is the problem of equality. And for those of you who've read some Arendt carefully, you know that for her, equality is one of the most consequential but also problematic ideas that has been introduced into the modern world. She struggles with equality throughout all of her writing, certainly in the Origins of Totalitarianism, where she's writing about antisemitism. And she says, look, on the one hand, Jews want equality. On the other hand, equality will kill the Jews, because if really everyone is equal and you get rid of all privileges, Jews won't be able to distinguish themselves and live separate from the non-Jews, and their way of life will eventually disappear. And that there's thus a way in which the Jews want equality, but also can't embrace equality fully and still be Jews. And one way that Arendt begins to think about this issue is that there are different spheres of life, different realms. And she usually talks about there being three, right? There's the political realm, there's the social realm, and there's the private realm. And what she says is one of the great achievement of modern political thought and modern political life is the belief that we should be equal in the political realm, right? This was the great insights of people like Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant, and others of this period, that politically, all people are equal and should be treated equally under the laws. But the problem is that there are times when equality is not only not it is for her a problem. For example, in society, if you're a member of a church, whether it's a Christian church or a Jewish church or a mosque or whatever it is, Jewish temple or a Islamic mosque, it's not equal. Christians are going to be privileged in the church, and Jews are going to be privileged in the temple, and Muslims are going to be privileged in the mosque. And in social life, she says, the basic principle is always discrimination, not equality. We hang out with people who are like ourselves. And that's true in a church, and it's true also in a chess club where we want to hang out with chess players, or in a resort where we want to hang out with people like ourselves. And she says in the social realm, the basic principle is discrimination, and equality is the end of the social world. And then there's the realm of privacy, where, again, we want to be private with our family or our loved ones, with our friends. And not only do we exclude people who we don't make into our private world, but the whole principle of the private world is one of uniqueness, or people we really want to be together with on a very close, intimate, loving a level. And obviously that can't be felt under the principle of equality. And so she says that the race issue in the South raises this principle. And what it does is it forces us into what she says is a difficult but necessary reevaluation of what desegregation means, right? This is 1957 in the United States. We've lived through slavery, we lived through Jim Crow, and we lived through segregation. And she said, we're now at a period where the country seems ready to embark on something called desegregation, and it's just started, right? So 2 years before this, you had Brown v. Board of Education, or 3 years before this. And we're beginning this process of desegregation. And she says we need to ask some very difficult questions based on the principle of equality, which is the base principle of how we should think about desegregation along lines of race. And so she says one question is, can discrimination include the right to choose one's neighbors, right? Should I, as someone who lives in New York City, should I be able to live in a neighborhood with people like myself, whether it's all Jews or all Muslims or all Black people or all white people? Should I be able to live in an integrated neighborhood and say I want to control it and make sure it doesn't become one race or one religion? How much is where I live? Is that a social thing, a social question of discrimination, or is that a public political question of equality? Similarly, she says, should discrimination, what do we do about discrimination in trains and buses and in public transport? And she says, in this case, this kind of discrimination offends our human dignity, our feeling of human dignity, because why should some people be allowed to sit in the front of the bus and other people not, or some people ride this bus? She goes, that seems just completely at odds with our idea of human dignity. She also says that the question of the schools is a borderline question, because schools are both public and private, and also in some degrees social. And so she says it was probably a mistake to begin desegregation with the schools because it's a more difficult and controversial issue. And as you know, she offers a couple of areas where she thinks it would have been smarter to start desegregation: voting, what she calls public communications, so laws and public edicts, and then also she mentions in the Little Rock essay, laws against marriage. these, she says, would be much more non-controversial ideas. But so the point is, she talks about this question of, if the issue of race is the one around equality, we have to start having a real conversation about what kind of equality we mean: public, political equality, social equality, private equality. And that's the way she thinks about this. Similarly, she says there's another deep, basic issue around the question of race in the South, and that's the question of state versus federal rights. As you know, Arendt was a big believer that one of the great virtues of the American Republic was the principle of federalism. Insofar as, for her, what federalism means is that power is divisible and it's not centralized in one place. If power is centralized, she thinks it can lead to tyranny. Power is decentralized and divisible. You can still have lots of power without it becoming dangerous, of becoming tyrannical. And so she wants to preserve this federalist structure and federalist decentralization of power, but at the same time recognize that currently the states' rights decentralization of power argument is preventing the needed elevation of equality in the public realm. And so she says this is another basic question. How can we increase equality, require equality, and yet not weaken regional power, and thus not weaken the union as a whole, in her mind? She also talks about some other issues: privacy, which she refers to the McCarthy hearings, passports, and other things. But I'll skip those for now. But you have a sense of the way she is talking and thinking about race in her letter to McCarthy. I mean, to Hutchins in 1957. 5 years later, in 1962, she reads James Baldwin's essays, Letter from a Regional Mind, which later became, I think, the second essay in the book he published, Fire Next Time. And in that essay, near the end of it, Baldwin sort of waxes a little bit rhetorically, I don't know, philosophical, but also exuberantly about the potential to solve the race question as he sees it through love. And so I'll just read an excerpt from the end of this essay in the New Yorker, which is, I think, the part Arendt was referring to. And Baldwin writes in 1962, when I was very young and was dealing with my buddies in those wine and urine-stained hallways, something in me wondered, what will happen to all that beauty? For Black people, though I'm aware that some of us, Black and white, do not know it yet, are very beautiful. And when I sat at Elijah's table and watched the baby, the women, and the men, and we talked about God's or Allah's vengeance, I wondered, when that vengeance was achieved, what will happen to all that beauty then? I could also see that the intransigence and ignorance of the white world might make that vengeance inevitable. A vengeance that does not really depend on and cannot really be executed by any person or organization, and that cannot be prevented by any police force or army. Historical vengeance, a cosmic vengeance based on the law that we recognize when we say, whatever goes up must come down. And here we are at the center of the arc, right? Trapped in the gaudiest, most valuable, and most improbable water wheel the world has ever seen. Everything now we must assume is in our hands. We have no right to assume otherwise. If we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious Blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others, if we do not falter in our duty now, we may be able, handful that we are, to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible and song by a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. So Arendt is reading this essay by Baldwin, where Baldwin says that there's a beauty in the urine-stained hallways and that Black people are beautiful, and that there's the possibility that vengeance, namely the vengeance for the injustice of the world and the injustice of racism, will erase that beauty. And that somehow we are in the position now of maybe, as he says, being able to respond to this in a way that will end the racial nightmare, and that this requires love. And Arendt reads this and writes the following letter to Mr. Baldwin. Dear Mr. Baldwin, your article in the New Yorker is a political event of a very high order, I think. It certainly is an event in my understanding of what is involved in the Negro question. And since this is a question which concerns us all, I feel I am entitled to raise objections. What frightened me in your essay was the gospel of love, which you begin to preach at the end. In politics, love is a stranger, and when it intrudes upon it, nothing is being achieved except hypocrisy. All the characteristics you stress in the Negro people, their beauty, their capacity for joy, their warmth, and their humanity, are well-known characteristics of all oppressed people. They grow out of suffering, and they are the proudest possession of all pariahs. Unfortunately, they have never survived the hour of liberation by even 5 minutes. Hatred and love belong together, and they are both destructive. You can afford them only in private, and as a people, only so long as you are not free. In sincere admiration, cordially, that is in case you remember that we know each other slightly, yours, Hannah Arendt. All right. What do we make of this letter? I think some people have said the first thing to make of it is that it's sort of arrogant. It's an interesting question. I'm of two minds of that. On the one hand, it's obviously quite fawning, in the sense of she's writing to James Baldwin and saying it's a political event of very high order, and it's made a huge impact in my understanding. On the other hand, she's certainly setting herself as an equal to discuss the race question with James Baldwin, and it sort of immediately raises an objection. And some people say it's just an arrogant letter. It's hard. I can see that, and I can also see it as simply a serious letter, treating him as an equal. But as you may, I think there's a question of what in this essay is an event, not only in politics, but in her own understanding of what she calls the Negro question. What is more clear here is what her objection is, right? Her objection is the gospel of love, this idea of what Baldwin had referred to as what will happen to all that beauty, right? For Black people are beautiful, he said, and he's worried that beauty will disappear by revenge. And he says what can save it is a gospel of love. And her worry is that this gospel of love that he's preaching, this love of the closeness and the warmth of that he found means being amongst other Black people, their beauty, their capacity for joy, their warmth, their humanity. She says these are characteristics of all oppressed peoples. And here, of course, she's speaking from her experience as a Jew. And their privileges of what she calls the privilege of pariahs. In another essay, she says the privileges include humanity, kindness, freedom from prejudice, sensitiveness to injustice. The point is that if you're a pariah and you're oppressed, you can treat everyone kindly and you can treat everyone as if justice should rule because you have no power and you have no responsibility. She says, you know, that these privileges of the pariah are quite beautiful and loving, and yet they don't survive the hour of liberation by even 5 minutes. What she means that as soon as you're liberated, as soon as you're free and you have to act as equals in the public realm, you can't privilege your own people. You can't privilege, you can't act as if you're living simply in private or in a social world. You have to suddenly act differently. And what she's saying, I think, to James Baldwin is, you're never going to solve the race question through a gospel of love. You have to turn to politics. She says in another essay writing about this privilege of the pariah peoples and the warmth of persecuted people, she says, in its full development, the privileges of the pariah can breed a kindliness and sheer goodness of which human beings are otherwise scarcely capable. The privileges of the pariah include a joy in the simple fact of being alive and the great privilege of being unburdened by a care for the world. Indeed, the compassion nurtured amongst pariahs has become central to the revolutionary-minded humanitarian of our times. But this privilege of the pariah, she thinks, can't form the basis of a politics. And that's what she's objecting to in Baldwin. One other element of what she's objecting to, and this relates to the conference we're having in the fall, is that for her, politics cannot include love. It can include respect and friendship. When you're on the subway in New York, or you're walking down the street in, who knows, Mumbai, you can respect strangers. You can see someone of a different religion, of a different sect, of a different race, and you can see them as an equal, but you can't love them. We can be friends with strangers, and that's why friendship is core to Arendt's idea of politics, but we can't love strangers. And that's why love is dangerous for politics, for Arendt. All right. This brings us to the third and last of the letters that we're reading. And this is a letter that Hannah Arendt writes to Ralph Ellison on July 29th, 1965. So 3 years after the letter to Baldwin. I should note that neither of the letters to Baldwin nor to Ellison were ever answered. Neither Baldwin nor Ellison answered the letter. The letter that Arendt writes is a response to an interview that Ellison gave to Robert Penn Warren that was published in Penn Warren's book, Who Speaks for the Negro? And in that interview, Ellison had offered a critique of Arendt's essay, Reflections on Little Rock, which had been written in 1957 and published in 1959. And the interview carries the title, quote, Naked Violence and the Ideal of Sacrifice. Arendt's letter is not found in Ellison's papers. We don't know if he ever got it. We don't know if he ever read it. We have no idea. But in the letter, Arendt says, you are entirely right. This is to Ellison, writing to Ellison about his interview. It is precisely this ideal of sacrifice which I didn't understand. And since my starting point was a consideration of Negro kids in forcibly integrated schools, this failure to understand caused me indeed to go in an entirely wrong direction. Arendt adds that all the criticisms she had received from her liberal friends, she said, had not bothered her. And yet she continues, quote, I knew that was somehow wrong and thought I hadn't grasped the element of stark violence, of elementary bodily fear in the situation. But your remarks seem to me so entirely right that I now see that I simply didn't understand the complexities of the situation. So the question is, in 20 short lines of this letter to Ellison, Arendt says, "You are right. I misunderstood. I was wrong, and it led me astray." And the question really that this unanswered letter raises for us is, what did Arendt find so persuasive in Ellison's critique? What is it that, just like with Baldwin, she says, you know, your essay was as an event that changed politics, but also changed me, but she never says what it is that changed in her. She only tells what her objection is. Similarly, here with Ellison, what's changed? I mean, we have very little to go on. She says, "I knew that something was wrong, and I hadn't grasped the element of stark violence, of elementary bodily fear in the situation. But your remark seems to me so entirely right that I now see I simply didn't understand the complexities of the situation." Well, the essay was titled, the interview was titled "Naked Violence and the Idea of Sacrifice." But Ellison's rejection of Arendt's standpoint in the interview was actually more fundamental than what Arendt is here conceding. He had asked in the interview, how could she shut her eyes before the actual daily emergency? And how could she pay no attention to the systematic exclusion of Blacks from the formation of the country? Ellison saw that Arendt, quote, had absolutely no conception of the situation of Blacks. That was his critique. She doesn't address that. She simply says she didn't understand the element of stark violence, bodily fear, and you were right. And so this raises a question of what exactly we take. And so here we have three letters, one from 1957, one from 1962, and one from 1965, all three dealing with race. The latter two both saying that major Black political figures had written something that made Arendt radically question her own opinions and see the world and see the question of race differently. But we don't really know, or I don't really know, exactly what changes emerged. It's sort of a mystery, and I think it's one of those mysteries that will be written about, sometimes humbly and sometimes with great passion, for decades and decades, maybe centuries. But I think these are incredibly suggestive and productively thoughtful letters that can be rethought. For those of you who do read German, there's a wonderful little book, I think I've mentioned before, 370 Riverside Drive, 730 Riverside Drive. So 370 Riverside Drive is where Hannah Arendt lived for 20 years, and 730 Riverside Drive is where Ralph Ellison lived. And Marie-Louise Knott, who's going to be speaking at the Arendt conference next year, will be the Arendt Center National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow next year, wrote this wonderful book about Ellison and Arendt, where she really delves quite thoughtfully into what we can make of this in exchange or non-exchange between Ellison and Arendt. And so if any of you read German, I highly recommend this book as a way through. All right. The chat is open. Please be respectful. It's also, you can also go down to the reactions button and click raise hand and join the conversation. And I look forward to the conversation here. Bob.
Thank you, Roger. As you know, Arendt's Habilitationsschrift was on the concept of love in St. Augustine. So tell us what your thoughts are in that context regarding the Baldwin letter.
Yeah. So by the way, this book on love and St. Augustine is the one book of Arendt's we've never read in this reading group. the one monograph of Arendt's we've never read in this reading group. And it's another book we could at some point read. We have never done so, and I'd like to. So in that book, which is I don't think it's her habilitación, Bob, it's her dissertation. So it's her undergraduate thesis. But she distinguishes neighborly love from appetite, or more kind of what's it called? Desire or lust. And so she's interested in this idea of neighborly love as a kind of political love or respect, which she'll develop later as the idea of friendship. So it's a love that's a public love, and so it's not love in the sense of a strong feeling of passionate bonds with loved ones or with people in private who you share, you know, like a hidden world with. It's the love you share with your neighbors in public. And so the Love and St. Augustine book is a book early on in her career, in which she begins to think about love, but love in this neighborly sense as a foundation of politics. That would be, you know, which is, so in a way, it might be a good book for us to read soon, because it does connect with her ideas of friendship more than it does with love. So is that helpful, Bob? I can't go fully into the book. To be honest, it's not a book I know well, which is a good reason to read it. And maybe we will soon.
Yeah, I haven't read it in years, but it just struck me as perhaps Arendt was moving away from what she was thinking, you know, back in, I don't know what, 1930.
30, yeah. I think it's actually quite consistent with it, because I think this neighborly love idea is different from passionate love.
Well, which one was Baldwin talking about, or was he
Baldwin
talking
would
about?
be talking about a more passionate, private idea of love, at least as Arendt's reading it. I mean, you know, again, she was no expert on Baldwin, and one could try and, you know, I'd have to go back and read the whole essay of Baldwin's, but the way she's reading it is that the gospel of love he's talking about is love that emerges out of his experience with other Black people in the hallway, the urine stained hallways, and in around the homestead. And it's that feeling of closeness, not based on a kind of respect for strangers, but of a closeness of a co-religionist in a Jewish sense, or someone of the same race and experience. And so it's not a kind of public love, it's a kind of more private love. That's how she's reading it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Stephen.
Well, at the risk of being repetitious, I went back and read the following, which is a quote: "A people is an assemblage of reasonable beings bound together by a common agreement as to the objects of their love. Then, in order to discover the character of any people, we have only to observe what they love. Yet, whatever it loves, it is only an assemblage of reasonable beings and not of beasts," etc. That's St. Augustine in The City of God. And so, yeah, I have the same problem. My question, which maybe you've already answered with Bob, is she seems a long way from St. Augustine here, which is surprising, given her acquaintance and oft expressed admiration for Augustine. how do we reconcile this Augustinian position with what she's saying here? Is she distinguishing one type of love versus another, which I think is the answer you just suggested, or was there some sea change in her thought that can
No, I
explain
think-
this between 1930 and 1960?
Okay, so with the caveat that, again, I'm neither an expert in Augustine nor her book on Augustine, which I haven't read in a long time. I think it's entirely consistent, right? I mean, Augustine's idea of love that he's embraced, that he's discussing in the City of God, is not a private love. It's not a lustful love, right? In fact, the whole premise of, I mean, well, one of the core arguments that Augustine is trying to make is that the love of God is not a lustful love, is not a passionate love. It's a dispassionate, respectful love. And it's a love that's rational, and that it's the basis for what she'll call neighborly love, and which he calls neighborly love, which is the kind of love of a people around a common world. It's not people who are very different and love very different things and love very different kinds of people, can nevertheless share a kind of public love for a way of life that allows for diversity and plurality within it, but that is the public life of a people. So I think it's actually quite consistent with what she's saying in 1962.
Thanks.
Yeah. Bill.
Hey, Roger. You know, for weeks now, we've been reading this and I have resisted speaking. I wondered what you were doing. I thought, okay, we'll get to the point where Mr. Ellison comes in, and anything that you might say, not to mention the brilliant people on this call, is not worth saying. But it raises another question for me. What are we doing here? I don't know if this is something I could have written to you in an email, Roger, but maybe I should say it now. Remember about almost 2 years ago, and when there was such a lather, George Floyd, there was a resurgence of anti-colonialism or decolonization, and I said, and I don't think I was alone, I didn't get many amens, that, you know, I think you should put a disclaimer. Not a disclaimer. You should say that when people study Hannah Arendt, you have to realize you're dealing with an individual who comes from a certain time, a certain place, and therefore we have to have respect for this Promethean ability she has with distinctions and philology, all the stuff that I'm learning from her. I must say I've not really gotten a lot other than a tight stomach from these last few weeks. That's one thing I will say. You, at that point, you said, no, most certainly not. I will not frame her in some way. I will not bracket her. And something else happened in that conversation. I think it was Vivian who took me on. And I said, well, you know, I just wish that she had lived long enough to be in our era. Because I think some of these things that she was just discovering, i.e., how Black people feel, is part of where we live now.
Yeah.
And do I dare bring the bad word in, woke? Do you all know that woke comes from the Black church? And now it's a bad word. It means it's something silly and weak and poorly thought out, but it was about having a kind of revelation. So Baldwin, and I wish that, I felt that you even read it with a tinge of irony. It's not your style either. When you didn't even know how to talk about when he becomes a preacher, when he begins to speak as a Black man, when it's beyond the language of philosophical discourse, and he wants to change the tenor of it, which America has been forced to, and we're still fighting about that, aren't we? Yeah, about who speaks for the Negro, says Mr. Warren. Well, how does America speak? America is Black, and it's mixed. And everybody, probably most people on this call know what I'm talking about. So there's one other thing. In James Baldwin's Another Country, and I don't know if you have read it, in one of these most amazing scenes, the young Black woman who is having a relationship with a white man, and they've had a horrible night. He is sitting in his chair because there's this gulf between them as people that is rooted in race and their sexual relation, and he's weeping. She, and Baldwin describes it, comes up and begins to stroke him as he sobs, stroking out his innocence. Nobody stroked out Ms. Arendt's innocence. And that is maybe what I think you're trying to, this does not, I can't wait to get away from this, because I don't want to deal with another innocent white person again, a great one, but innocence. And also it's exiled now. It feels like her problems there. I'm going to compliment this group of people here and say, I don't think these are, most people on this call now, I hope you know Black people. I hope you know that Black people do not always speak about St. Augustine or Kant or what have you, but there's another way which has become valid discourse. And don't get me wrong here. This is not just take your private feelings and go feel in your room. Discourse has been changed by the color of the people having the discourse. Now that's where we're at right now. So I don't need any more. I want to get back to what I think she really is able to do, because this is not really helping. I don't know that I learned very much about race from this. I learned about what people of her description in her time didn't know, but then we all know that. Films are made about it, right? So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bill. That's, as you know, that's incredibly helpful, and I think you've hit on a lot of what I think we need to discuss, right? Hannah Arendt didn't know many Black people, at least that I know of. She, her good friend Charlotte Barat, who lived quite close to her in New York and had also been a refugee, sought out members of the Black community and wrote about issues of Black relations. And Fiona Schmidt, who at the Arendt Center has been working on these kind of questions, and it really and did so in a way that was much more open to the Black experience and the Black feeling than Arendt ever did. And so one thing I think we're doing here, right, to answer your question, is becoming aware of that, right? And you could say, well, we all knew that. Yeah, okay. But we're seeing what I think is clearly a lacunae in Arendt's thought and understanding of both the American experience and race. That's one thing. Second thing we're seeing is that in 1962, when she reads the New Yorker article by James Baldwin, and then again in 1965, when she reads the interview by Ellison, she is struck by that lacunae, right? I mean, this, to use the language I think you rightly used, it's probably the first two times, or two of the most powerful times in her life, where she came to understand that she didn't understand the Black experience, and began to be, awakened, as you rightly said. And so, I think if you're interested in Hannah Arendt from a purely, as a thinker of Hannah Arendt, this is at the period, between 1962 and 1965, when the civil rights movement is in full swing, and you're seeing, a now American citizen of Jewish descent who'd been in camps, who had escaped the Nazis, coming over, and you're seeing her, in a sense, waking up in that sense, and becoming aware of some of the inadequacies and limits of her thinking. So purely from a historical, biographical, point of view, I think this is interesting. But if that were all, Bill, I would probably not have chosen to do this, right? There's another reason, another thing that I think we are doing here, and it's the more controversial aspect of what I think we're doing here. And yet I obviously think it's important. And that's that even though Arendt admits to Ellison that she didn't understand and she went down a wrong path, and even though she says to Baldwin, you've changed me as well as changed politics, she doesn't give up on her basic approach to race, which is consistent from the Origins up through the late 1960s, which is, I think, an approach that she outlines in the letter to Hutchins, which is that to think about race means to think about equality. And equality is, as she says in another essay, one of the most fateful and dangerous ideas ever introduced. And we need to think about it, and we need to take it seriously, and we need to know where to fight for equality, when to fight for equality, and when to understand that too much equality in too many places and too many different realms is dangerous and is a bad thing. And so what are we doing? We're on the one hand understanding that, yes, Arendt was a woman of her time. She was a brilliant woman of her time, but she was a woman of her time. She was someone who, on the one hand, certainly had prejudices, as does everybody, certainly had limits, and she became aware of her limits, which I think is something that is rare, and especially in someone who's a public figure, admitting they're becoming aware of their limits, but okay. But I think the bigger question for me is, she still believed, even as she became more aware and more awakened, that the way a lot of liberals were thinking about these questions was going to lead to dangerous approaches, and approaches to the problem of the race question, the Jewish question, the race question, that would threaten the basic balance of power between states and the federal government in the United States, and B, threaten to bring about a kind of social totalitarianism or social conformity and a social demand for equality, and that would not only destroy the public realm, but would destroy the private realm. And she held on.
You mean what the conservatives call now the deep state? It sounds like all of this is an attack. It could be used. What you're saying, Roger, is she was way ahead of the discussion in the attack on neoliberalism. She was way ahead, because those are all the points they're making right now. You all are, you're so woke, so politically correct, that you're missing that we have to make some hard decisions in a democracy.
Yeah.
That not everyone is equal at all times. And I don't know where this came from. All men are created by their, given by their creator certain rights like life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It's in our founding document. So the founders got it wrong, right? Because they fell for this idea that we could be equal in all situations, which led poor schmucks like myself, born in 1952, in the era of Brown versus Board of Education, to believe, truly believe it. But we saw when Mr. Obama was elected president, something, it had been breaking, but it broke. And you see where we are now. Marjorie Taylor Greene and people can actually take a crap on the floor of the legislature and say things, wipe their butt with the Constitution. It's their right. And so I'm not sure you're giving a very eloquent rebuttal, and but there's something about how she can be used in a pernicious way with the very things that you're saying right now. So, but then we're thinking without banisters, and that should be a scary proposition, right? So that's what we're doing here. Thinking without banisters. We should have tight stomachs and be afraid.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I was simply trying to answer what your question, which I think is a good question, of what we are doing here, and to the extent that I brought us here, what I think we're doing here. It wasn't an attempt to offer a rebuttal, although maybe it is. It was simply to say, I think we're doing three things, right? We're looking at her intellectual biography. We're looking at her being changed by her experience of two encounters with two different intellectuals, Black intellectuals. And three, we're looking at her saying, even though I've been changed, even though I see these things, and even though I'm waking up, and obviously she had a way to go, and I'm not saying she was woke or anything like that. She's raising important questions, and I do, and the way you put it is the way I've been saying it. I think she was way ahead of the game, and I think she is offering, I think that in a sense, her work on race has been ignored, and intentionally or unintentionally, in part because she wasn't woke early on, and she said things that and did things that were as you said, part of the time. And she's been, in a sense, disqualified or not taken seriously as having something meaningful to say about the question of race today. Whereas I think there are very few other thinkers out there who actually offer real warnings about a kind of common sense view about race of at least two parts, right? One is we should just pursue all kinds of equality. And two, that we should give up on federalism in the name of a kind of stronger national government, because that was the way to address the decadence of the South. And I understand both of these arguments. And yet I think Arendt is offering meaningful critiques of both of them that are actually need to be heard today. And now people can disagree with me. You can disagree with me. I'm just saying that's what I think I'm doing, or we're doing, is saying that we have gone down a road that she told us 60, 70 years ago we're going down, right? We're going to pursue equality too far. And we're going to pursue federal power too far. And these are going to have negative unintended consequences. And we need to be able to think about race and have a conversation about race that goes down to these basic principles that we're not addressing. That's what I think we're doing. That's what I think she was doing. And that's the kind of conversation I'm trying to gently bring us back to, even though I know it's difficult.
It's implicitly violent, Roger. You understand that, it's okay. I mean, we're big kids here. We came with you on this journey about thinking without banisters, but I don't know what didn't she understand? She could not hear the cadences of Black speech. That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Okay. And she could not hear it because she just hadn't been exposed to it. Or quite frankly, this is where that ugly accusation is that she was racist comes. she didn't feel she had to. And that's another whole discussion, but I've taken more time, but thank you, Roger, for being brave. And I'm here for that. I'm here for that. Thanks, Roger.
Well, thanks, Bill. I always appreciate that. Susan. Yeah.
That's a hard one to follow. So thank you, Bill. My question is, in the letter to Robert Hutchins, she actually says on page 97 that the social is where we earn our living. And I've not seen her, in my view, acknowledge the social as the marketplace anywhere else. And I'm wondering if she does, if this shows up anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I'm, part of the reason I'm sort of struggling to answer is it sort of seems to me it shows up a lot of places, but maybe I'm wrong. But for her, the social is that realm in which we the realm of society, and that includes the realm in which we do business. So, if I have a bakery, I can hire who I want to hire, right? If I have or that's a question, right? But it's typically, I mean, if I come here from Ukraine and I start a store, I might hire a bunch of Ukrainians because I trust them. Or if I'm Chinese, I hire some Chinese people to work in my Chinese restaurant or my Chinese grocery. This is the realm of where we make a living. It's the realm where we socialize. It's the realm in which we sometimes take vacations. All of these are part of the social for her. And the question, that she poses in the lecture to Hutchins and that I've suggested to just now in answering Bill's question that, she's raising is, where is discrimination appropriate, given that on the one hand, we want to live in a country of equality, and on the other hand, we want to live in a country that allows for social distinction and social difference. And how do we make those decisions? And that's the question that I think she doesn't ever abandon. I think one question that now has to be raised is, after 1962 and after 1965, does she change her tune, right? Would she change what she said about schools? Would she change what she said about Jewish resorts? Would she say that there should be a wider realm of equality and a smaller social realm? And I think that and I think that is likely the answer. Although I don't know. I mean, she never wrote about it again, as far as I know. But that's the kind of question that I think we're trying to raise here.
So I guess I just think that she often talks about social in very negative ways, but she also talks about it as the newcomer. And if you're looking at economics and the marketplace, that's as old as it gets. So I'm not, I'm seeing some contradiction, I guess, in acknowledging that we have really have no choice but to be in the marketplace, and that's been from time immemorial.
So just so you know, she's not negative about the social. The social is an essential aspect of human life. What she's negative about is the increased importance of the social, insofar as we live more and more of our lives in the social, and in doing so, right, begin to demand that those traditionally social aspects of our life now conform to either political ideals like equality or private ideals like uniqueness. What we do is either corrupt the social, or we corrupt the political and the private, and the social takes over. At one point in her life, that's what she's worried about, right? She's worried about the social, which is a realm of discrimination, overwhelming the political and overwhelming the private. And the real problem with that from her point of view is that since the social is based on the principle of like hangs out with like, or like attracts like, as the social becomes more powerful, society becomes more conformist, less accepting of plurality and difference, and thus more quasi-totalitarian. And that's the rise of social totalitarianism that she's worried about. And so that's the aspect of the social that she's negative about. Not that it exists, but that it becomes all encompassing and takes over the political and the private. Okay.
Thank you.
George. George, you're muted, so you're gonna have to unmute, please.
Back to Bill's point, I think that we're talking about all these letters. I think one letter that I think would be very helpful is Arendt's letter about the Eichmann trial to Carl Jaspers. That's where she's being hypersocial, discriminatory, to the point that it becomes quasi-racial. That is, she's talking about Eastern European Jews, she's talking about quote unquote Orientals and things of that sort in a very disparaging way. It's hugely Germanocentric, which she has been all along, and she always was and remained Germanocentric. And I think all these things contribute to this whole area where she doesn't really belong that much. And the things we're talking about here, basically, yes, she was pressured in certain ways, but the thing about individual rights versus social and national rights is a hot dispute that's going on right now, and where the nation state is coming back and the whole business, as it was rightly noted. So in that sense, I think that at that time she brought up the right issues to discuss. But the thing is, you know, the human right angle is an Enlightenment concept, and then there's the post-Enlightenment and the new postmodernism and the whole thing business, which is being hotly discussed right now. And sort of it's nice that she was there at a certain time in history to point that these things exist. But I think we're way beyond that right now.
Well, first of all, yeah, I mean, you're right about the Jaspers letter, you know, where she talks about the Ostjuden and things. It would maybe be good to include that, and Jana, let's think about including that in our syllabus on this question. You know, your last statement, which I think if I understand you and Bill correctly, mirrors what Bill said, which is that we're beyond this, right? You know, and I think Bill really got this right, if I understood it, which is hopefully we're beyond this in the sense that we have embraced, or at least are aware of, the importance that America is a country in which blacks are an essential voice, and that the voice of not of blacks and other oppressed people, but certainly Black Americans who have been here since 1619 and have formed an enormous part of this country's history, are part of the American voice and fabric, and need to be fully heard and respected, is something that I think is absolutely right. And I think Arendt didn't appreciate until, if ever, but certainly not until 1962 and 1965, right? I think that's something that reading these letters has taught me. Let's put it that way. And I think it was a useful lesson for me. I may just be retrograde and other people may not need it. But I found that to be a useful lesson. As someone who has to talk about Arendt a lot in public forums as well as teaching, it's good for me to know that. It's good to me know her limits, where she, how she confronted those limits, that she confronted those limits, etc. But I'll just repeat to the extent I can what I said earlier to Bill, which is that while I think you're both right that the average person today, and certainly the average person on this call, is much more awokened to the centrality of the Black experience and Black voices, both historically and present, than Arendt ever was.
Robert, just let me because I thank you for what you're trying to say here, but I don't mean just Black voices. I mean, Asian people are speaking in ways that the Asian people didn't speak before. Trans people, there are voices now. So to listen to American parlance, we have to have ever more sophisticated ears. That's all I'm saying.
I guess I'm just trying to agree with you and say it. I think that there's always this debate about to what extent the Black voice has a kind of some priority insofar as the question of slavery was the dominant question in this country, and segregation and Jim Crow were dominantly focused on the Black oppressing of Black people, as opposed to, there certainly were Jewish and Asian indentured servants and others, but it was a Black experience. But okay, I mean, I certainly take that as a friendly amendment to what I was saying.
Yeah, if I may, just to finish up one thing, as far as where when she did actual harm to the situation, is in her other aspect of the Eichmann thing, where she was blaming the Jews for complicity, the Jewish councils, which are mostly Eastern European Jews, in the Holocaust. That's a whole different story, but we're talking about the same thing, of her speaking really out of school.
Okay, so I don't agree with that, but we'll come back to that, and we've talked about that when we read Eichmann, and we'll talk about it again when we read Eichmann again. But what I want to just add is that whatever her limits, and we are now encountering and experiencing her limits, and I think it's important to do so, that should not prevent us from recognizing that she may be one of the thinkers who has most deeply thought through what she calls in that letter to Hutchins, the basic questions that the acute problems of race require us to address. And that her voice today in thinking through these questions is absolutely essential. That's my view, right? I'm just telling you my view. I'm happy to have people disagree with it, and I'm happy to talk about it. But what I don't want to happen is people say, oh, well, she was racist, therefore we can't include her voice, right? And so that's another part of what we're trying to do today. Say, look, there are limits, but those limits shouldn't disqualify the deep thoughts she had from being relevant today, if they're relevant. And then we can have a conversation with they're relevant. I just wrote a 50-page paper trying to argue that they're relevant to a particular question. That will come out soon, and people will be able to read it, and they'll be able to say, I agree with Roger, I disagree with Roger, right? But what I don't want, I hope is not going to happen, is people say you can't talk about Arendt on these issues because she was a racist. That's part of what I'm hoping to do as well. Joanne.
I certainly would not say that she was a racist. I would say more that, in line with some of the things Bill said, that she just had no idea. We have a little better idea now than we did, we being a whole country. But it's admirable that she tried to talk about these issues. That, it's admirable and it's heroic in a way. I wanted to go to the issue of the types of equality, because I think there are some problems in that. She says there's political equality relates to the political realm, the social realm, and the private realm. Is that right?
Yeah.
I don't have the text right in front of me.
No, that's right. That's right.
There, on the one hand, she tries to avoid metaphysical systems, but she sneaks in these distinctions that are meta from time to time. And so I find it problematic sometimes to make a distinction between the political and the social, for example. And she puts public education and Little Rock into the private realm or the social realm. I think she allows it a little bit of the political realm, but I think to not see that as political, I mean, we were talking about, literally laws in many, many states against integration in education. And just because education has an aspect of the social to it or the private, because some people can send their kids to private schools, most can't. But that to me does not mean that education is not in some extremely basic and serious way, that public education in the United States belongs to the political. And one other
Joanne, Joanne,
yeah,
I'm gonna, just because we're short on time, I'm
sorry. Yeah,
got-
go ahead.
I
Go
got
ahead. Would you just speak to that?
I got the question, and I'll try and answer it.
Yeah.
So, first of all, the laws against integrated education and requiring segregated education are for Arendt racist laws, unconstitutional laws, and laws that have to change. And so she fully supported the Brown decision, saying that the Jim Crow laws and the separate but equal were unconstitutional. And she never is arguing with that decision at all. To the extent she's criticizing something, it would be what's called Brown 2, the second Brown decision. And what she refers to in the essay as the forced integration. She thinks that the legal segregation is absolutely wrong and whatever. And so that's political. Now, what she says in both the Hutchins essay and elsewhere is that education is one of the more complicated areas because it is political, social, and private. And she never says we shouldn't integrate the schools. What she says is it was not where they should have begun. That's what she says. Now, she could be wrong, right? But she says, if you're worried about a backlash and you're worried about, and you actually want to improve the situation, you should begin in those situations which are, she thinks, have the widest agreement and the most the strongest justification. And she says education is the one that doesn't have that because it's a mix of public, private, and social. Whereas voting, marriage laws, etc., are for her obvious choices that should come before education. Now, I think she comes to recognize that she may have been wrong on this. And in fact, the letter to Ellison, that may be what she's saying. What she's not saying is the analysis is wrong, but she may be saying my judgment was wrong because I misunderstood the question of violence and bodily pain that was going on. I think that's what's being said, but she never says it directly, so we can't know. But that's a question of judgment of which one should come first and things like that. But I don't think that invalidates the general attempt to think through these questions with ideas of public, social, and private. They're not ever absolute. They always interweave and intersperse. But we just have to understand that there are parts of education which are private, and that if we simply make it purely public, we'll do a disservice.
Where would you put housing?
Well, that's a great question. And, there's a wonderful essay by a South African writer. I think it's Ang. Someone will remember, maybe someone knows it. It's called A Bantu in My Bathroom. Does anyone know who wrote that? I forget her. I forget the woman's name. She's a brilliant essay. This is shortly after the end of apartheid, and a woman puts an ad in a paper saying, I have a extra room in my house, and I'd like to rent it, looking for a white woman, right? And some radio or TV or some personality calls her up and makes fun of her online, right? And this woman, I think it's a Black South African woman, if I remember it correctly, writes this essay, A Bantu in My Bathroom, saying, this is actually a much more complicated issue than people have made it out to be. You shouldn't be able to determine who lives in the house next door to you. But if you're going to rent a room in your house, should you be able to say, I want someone like myself to live in my house? And is that racist? Or is that, anti-Semitic if you say, I want a Christian to live in my house in an extra room? So then say, okay, should it be in my house? I don't know. In my neighborhood? I don't know. And so what Arendt is saying is the question of should you be able to live in a community of all Jews is a very difficult question in a country like ours. Because to what extent is housing political? In some extent it is, and we want to have equality. And yet, isn't there also a way in which people want to live next to people like themselves? And should this discrimination should be unofficial, or should it be out in the open? Should you be able to say, I only want to live next to Muslims in a Muslim community or Orthodox Jewish community? And so, you're asking me the answer to the question. Arendt doesn't give an answer to the question. She says it's an open question. And it's one we have to have discussion about. She's providing, I think, a framework to have that discussion. And at some point we have to make personal judgments about it and argue for them.
Well, I just one quick thing. I live in Baltimore, and we had the first literally piece of legislation in the city in like 1905 for segregated housing.
That would be
political.
Yeah, that would be clearly illegal, right? The question is not, you can't legally require segregated housing. For her, that's an obvious question. The question is, if people self-segregate, should they be forced to integrate? Right? You're absolutely right. I mean, from a political, legal point of view, she's clear. No enforced segregation. The question is, should you force Like, let's say I have an extra room in my house, right? Should the government force me to rent it to a Muslim because I'm Jewish, because they want to create an integrated life? Or should I be able to do it and pick who I want? Well, that's how we currently say it. But I can't say I only want a Jew. I just have to say it's open, and then I have to pick the Jew who comes in, right? She's saying, how do we have that honest conversation? Or should we have that honest conversation? We're out of time, but I'll take, there's a bunch of people who still want to speak. All right. Maybe each of you can speak for 30 seconds and just say your question, and then I'll respond. So Kathy, Bruce, and Hannah, just because, we're out of time and I don't want to keep people too long.
I'll be real quick. My question or observation is the civil rights movement never demanded that there be total equality. They wanted equal opportunity, and that applied through all of the issues, housing, education, and so forth. So they weren't looking to necessarily integrate for the sake of integration. I think that was a white lens on it. And certainly in 62 to 65, almost no white people understood any of this. Arendt would have been typical in her understanding at that time. So I think we have to be honest about what was going on back then. And to the extent that there were many white supporters and activists in the civil rights, supporting the civil rights movement, but I think their lens was very different than what Bill was talking about around a Black voice and the ability to hear Black discourse, because that did not really happen in 62, 63, 64. There were almost no white supporters of the civil rights movement that had developed, certainly not me, developed that ear at that time.
Yeah, there were some for sure, but not many. You're right. Bruce? Again, quickly.
Yes,
brief.
thanks. I just wanted to share with you a thought. I was really struck in the Hutchins letter by the point she makes. Hutchins apparently wants his foundation to back this sort of official political philosophy framework that everybody can agree to, and then we can move forward and solve our problems, something like that. And she actually pushes back against that and says there's no, that would not be desirable even if we could do it. And then sort of talks about how the political theorist or the political philosopher, starts with the phenomenological understanding of how life is being lived, and the more normative and principled things bubble up from that. That was the passage that really struck me, because it sort of suggests a way of, it won't solve the problems we're wrestling with right now, today, right here, but it suggests a way of sort of maybe understanding what we can get from a thinker like Hannah Arendt, what we can't. And basically, I was reading this essay about her by Sheldon Wolin recently, and he ends with the following notion, which is kind of something I think that Bill has reminded us of also is going on today. So Wolin says,
Bruce, we're just
a sentence. I suggest modes of experience hinted at in the language of political theory. Some of it is very old. The language of participation, sharing, common experience, pooled contributions of diverse competencies, deliberation. If we were to explore the language, we would, I think, be both amending Hannah Arendt's thought and preserving it. Thanks.
Thank you. Hannah, can you also do it briefly, because we're now far over time? Hannah, you got to unmute.
I said, I think we finally, in your recent comments, but during this entire time of dealing with Arendt and racism, I don't think we ever really got at what is going on now in this country as it relates to what she was talking about. I think she was wrong flat out wrong in understanding the role of education in this country, the role of public education, the need for equal resources. I think she was flat out wrong. I think her conflation of social and political there just didn't work. But I think she anticipated things in the woke war that we're having on either side that's going on now in terms of flattening all levels of inequality, such that you have schools hiding, not letting white students know that there's a national merit test coming up so that they can study for it. There are actually cases like that, things like that, so that, this is a whole area where there's a totalitarianist sort of threat of equality in all domains, so that merit disappears, this, that, and the other thing. And I think that is a huge issue in this country that is going on now. And I think she was trying to touch on that, and that's why she kept going, thinking that education was the social. But, those are the areas that I think she has something to bring to the table. But I certainly think she was did not arrive. She did not understand racism in any really full way, I don't think. We hardly do ourselves, and we have much more outright exposure to other groups' feelings about it. So anyway, I just wanted to raise that.
Thank you. Well,
Okay.
thank you all for really, I happen to think that Bill and Hannah and others are right, that, in some ways we didn't get to some of these questions till the end, but, in reading some of these earlier essays, we
Very
talked a
helpful.
lot about these issues.
Yeah.
It was very intellectual, and then it really pops out at the end in these 3 essays. So maybe these 3 letters, maybe we should have read them at the beginning. I don't know.
It
But
was all good.
this was an experiment, and I'm hoping, at least I certainly found it useful and exciting. So I hope some of you did as well. My current thought is that we'll take a week off and then come back on April 28th and start this little book, Responsibility and Judgment. And we'll read the first 4 essays in that over the next few months, or next 2 months. So if you don't have it, try and get this book, and see you guys in 2 weeks. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Enjoy the spring.